So great to see so many of you here. It really is one of the positive things about this time, to be able to connect with people all over the place, all over the world. This pandemic has brought many things to light, not all positive, but if we're all well enough, fortunate enough to be well, and if we can transcend the quagmire of politics and other divisive media, one of the things that's really brought home to us is just how interconnected we are. And I mean globally as a species, and also biologically as members of the animal kingdom, if you like. And it also reminds us that social, economic, ecological, political, technical dimensions and dynamics of our world are all intrinsically coupled. So when this happened and we had to cancel our other seminars, we thought it would be nice to have a series of seminars where we look really broadly across disciplines at people who are doing all kinds of research to celebrate and harness these entanglements, to try and redesign our technological, economic, cultural infrastructures to the benefit of all living organisms. So today, I'm really delighted to introduce Sissel Tonn and Jonathan Rees, who collaborate as the artistic research duo Sensory Cartographies. Their work is a heady remix of ideas from neuroscience, philosophy, anthropology, and geography through a critical making practice. They explore the relationships between consciousness, body, and environment as mediated by mechanisms and sense technologies. So I'll pass you over to some people with better audio than me. Sensory Cartography.
Thanks, Alice. Thank you for inviting us. It's my second Zoom artist talk, and it's John's first. So we're just getting used to the format. Good to see some smiling faces in the rectangles that we're all sort of, I think, trying to get used to. So we want to talk a little bit about our project, Sensory Cartographies, which we worked on since 2016 intermittently. Apart from that, we each have our own artistic practice. We also do curating and community organizing under the name The Reading Room, where we're organizing study sessions together in non-institutional settings. I have a background in artistic research. I'm a visual artist working a lot with the idea of sensing one's environment. How can you explore the concept of sensing a change within an environment, both from the point of view of technological sensing, but also attunement and awareness that is affected by social, political, and mental impacts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that throughout the presentation. And John, do you want to say a few words?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm coming from more of a music and HCI background, and especially looking at kind of new instruments for music making and sort of affordances that different technological devices give to us as beings in the world. So yeah, my connection to this project is really kind of from a media critique perspective, I guess, of how mapping technologies sort of come to define the way that we experience environments and actually construct these environments. So yeah, I guess that's the main thing.
To start talking about sensory cartographies, we're going to share our screen. I don't think we should computer sound for this, right?
No, just for the video.
Okay, so I hope everybody can see. We're using web-based presentation format called the research catalog, which is a very sort of non-linear way of presenting the work. We will also share the link with you in the chat in case you would like to, well, maybe I'll do that later. we'll share the link later if you would like to go back and look at some of the references.
Okay, maybe we can share it so people can follow along. Oh no, they're watching. Okay, right. Can everyone see this? Is everyone able to see the screen we're sharing?
I guess so. Nobody's saying that.
If you can't, please say something. Yeah, so let's see, where do we start? Well, so I guess the origins of this project came from some work I had done with an anthropologist named Judith van der Els. She's a Dutch anthropologist, and she was working in the kind of the Pueblo region of the southwestern United States, researching geospatial technologies like remote sensing and satellite mapping and things like this, and trying to compare these forms of spatial knowledge to local spatial knowledges of the indigenous populations in that area. And the kind of loud and clear outcome of her research was this realization that these sort of spatial technologies are not universal across cultures in the way that they construct space. So this kind of like Google Maps top-down view of space, which we can kind of trace back to colonial era mapping technologies and even further, is not a universal form of understanding space, and is more a technology, more kind of like a specific sort of Eurocentric Western notation system. And so starting from there, we started thinking about, well, how can we as artists sort of approach this kind of ubiquitous understanding of space, of mapping space, and sort of try to break it open a little bit. So we've kind of employed a number of let's say, like tactics or approaches that come from our artistic practices to develop what we're calling kind of abstract cartographies. And we only call them abstract cartographies because we try to keep them as non-concrete as possible. So the techniques that we're using in our work is sensory augmentation, which is usually done through some sort of technological augmentation of the body, usually through wearable technologies or worn instruments and devices. The other kind of core concept that we try to crack open is the spatio-temporal relationship. So we try to think about maps as not sort of definitive placements of things, but more a way of notating relationships between things. So in our work, we're really interested in the relationship between like the sensing body and environments that are, could be urban environments, could be, let's call them natural environments, but also kind of, let's call them hybrid environments, which would be experiences of time and space in environments that are maybe only perceivable through augmentation, like for example, data streams received through some sort of wearable device or something like that. And the sort of the third aspect of this kind of creation of abstract cartographies is practices of world making and annotating. So we kind of like lump these two things together because the annotation or the collection systems we see as a way of sort of constructing these worlds. And the term world making is really nice because it also encapsulates a bit of like a fictional element to it and a cultural element. So space and place don't necessarily have to be these kind of objective, objectively empirical objects, but also have stories attached to them, have cultural, political, social realities for different groups of people. So we try to kind of bring that together into the act of cartographic practice in this kind of like weird abstract cartographic practice that we're trying to build. Yeah, so where should we go next? So some points of departure that we've really been inspired by are, well, the Marshall Islands stick maps, which are, I know also appear a lot in Shannon's work. For us, this is really, really an inspiring example because it's kind of a subjective map. And this is something that you don't, in Western cartography, you don't really think of so often. It's kind of the subjective aspect of map making. So that, I mean, the history of map making, even Western map making, always has this aspect of the cartographer going out and experiencing the world and then annotating it. And then that annotation becomes this sort of universal, or this tool that can be used by anybody to then kind of understand, control, lay claim to the space. But these Marshall Islands stick maps are super interesting because navigators would go out into the water on their boats and make these maps of water currents and island relationships and things like that. But the maps themselves are really only readable by the person who made them, in the sense that the annotation system is incredibly subjective. And we found this really interesting as kind of a provocation to think about what kind of mapping technologies we could build ourselves that would also have this aspect of idiosyncrasy, subjectivity, like a kind of a pluralism. I think that's maybe what we find really inspiring about these maps as kind of a starting point.
That they undergo change and they reflect the conditions of constant change that's unfolding in the environment.
Yeah, I mean, they literally encompass directionality, movement, things that are very rarely captured on what we think of as maps.
So another example that we found was this Luke Howard's taxonomy of clouds, where he was trying to develop almost like a hieroglyphic system for annotating the way that clouds were constantly changing in the sky. So that was also something we were kind of inspired by. I guess I can move on a little bit to the first project that we were working on that really kickstarted this project, which was an opportunity we had to go to the island of Madeira for a residency called Multi Madeira, which is an artist-run residency that we can really recommend. And
really wonderful Serbian group of artists who organize it.
Yeah, and when we found out we had gotten this opportunity, we started talking about Madeira, and I had actually been there before on another residency in 2013, where I was doing a kind of a drawing residency. And these are 3 of the drawings that I made. When I was there in 2013, I became really fascinated with the sort of social, natural history of the island. So actually, Madeira was mentioned a lot in Darwin's Origin of the Species because it was during this sort of age of exploration. It was a stopover for a lot of these ships that would go and conquer, but also employ this sort of newly developed Linnean nomenclature system, which you can see here. And as Richard Drayton says in Nature's Government, systems of classifications, as much as sextants and chronometers, allowed Europeans to perceive themselves as the magistrates of providence, equipped by their knowledge of its laws with responsibilities over all creation. So I became really kind of fascinated with how the place of Madeira was sort of like embedded into this very particular time in history, but also in natural science, and how that was visible in a sort of very tangible way in the landscape. So in Madeira, there is like I think 80% of the different species you can find there are non-endemic, because they would take different botanical specimens from South America and bring them to Madeira in order to acclimatize them there, so that they could be brought as this kind of like bounty into the orangeries of the European kings who were sponsoring these expeditions. So that you can really almost see as like a blueprint on the islands But at the same time, there's also, because Madeira is this kind of like mountain, tabletop mountain, on the top of the mountain, there's one of the oldest endemic forests of Europe. And it's constantly clouded in this, in like a cloud cover. So you can really feel like this constant change of the environment. And with that in mind, you can also go and visit this quite spectacular, a little bit in the wrong way, natural history museum that's in the botanical garden of Madeira. So on the one hand, there's a herbarium, which is one of the oldest herbariums, I think, in Europe. Started in like 1600s, and they have like I don't know how many different specimens there, and also a seed bank, which is so it's really like the embodiment of this kind of like desire to quantify and collect. And this is an image from their one of their main rooms that we put up against this very great Alfred North Whitehead quote, because there was some pretty spectacular bad taxidermy to be found in this little museum.
Oh,
sorry. Table malfunction. So with this in mind, we were really interested in trying to challenge this sort of like historical desire to quantify and to categorize the world, and try to see how we could create sort of like a kind of expedition where we would collect sensory experiences. And the way that we went about that was creating, a series of wearables. And I'm going to show you in a moment a film, which was a documentation of this kind of performative expedition that we did in the Lori Silva forest on the mountain of Madeira. But the different collection devices that you will see in this film needs a little bit of explanation. So the first thing that we created was these meta sensation collectors, which are worn biometric sensors that, well, I'm not good at explaining the technical terms so well, but what I kind of like about them is that they're picking up the electrodermal signal of the body, which is this kind of like electrical charge in the skin that changes as the body experiences the surroundings. So it's almost like it's something that happens at the interface between the sensing body and the changing environment, which of course becomes boiled down to a very simple graph. So it also embodies a little bit like this kind of like reduction into of a very diverse and overwhelming sensory experience of being in a place into a graph that can be yeah.
But I think that's kind of also just like a more general observation in this project is, I mean, this is in a sense another notation system, and we sort of are kind of trying to also draw a little bit of a red line between these impulses that were driving the colonial expansion, and with it this drive to kind of collect and quantify nature, and the kind of the same spirit that still exists, the same motive that exists in current geospatial technologies and biometric technologies. Mm-hmm. So there's always in these forms of technological capture and quantification, annotation, this like reductionist quality. Mm-hmm. And yeah, in a sense, it's a bit of it's always a negotiation. Mm-hmm. And we, in a sense, like approaching it in this way kind of brings more awareness to the negotiation between what is captured and what is not captured.
Mm-hmm. And very basically, the way that it was working was that we were wearing the sensors, and then as we were sensing it, there was the wearable were kind of like playing back a composition made from this data. So it's a little bit like sensing yourself sensing, because when you're getting sort of like a rush of arousal, the wearable will kind of like play it back to you in a very well, which you will see in the video. I think it's easier to just show the video.
It's also like the body itself is just a great sensor, and we can tap into it for all of the capabilities it has. But Sissel, maybe before playing the video, you should explain what these other ones are.
Yeah, and the other prosthetics that we were creating were also kind of like objects that would insert itself between our sensing body and the environment and kind of disorient a little bit how we were sensing this environment. So we have the plasticity goggles, which are inspired by research in neuroscience of how you can sort of like augment your vision. So they're turning your vision a little bit into maybe how an animal would see the world, or like a bird. And then we have the weather vane periscope, which is a periscope that goes on the face and where the wind directs where you can look. And the last one is the air pressure measurement harness, which is inspired by weather vanes and weather balloons, but it takes the air pressure. It has an air pressure sensor that translates into tactile sensation on the spine. So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to stop sharing the screen, then I will start sharing it again to show the video.
The world I perceive is a slice of impressions cut out of a vast sea of relation, of ever-fluctuating sights, odors, and sounds, interweaving and evolving over time. The world I perceive is a carefully selected process of filtration, intricately performed by my brain. Were I to perceive all these things at once, then my nervous system would experience sensory overload. Therefore, I'm evolved to pay attention to certain things in my environment while passing over others. Technologies have been invented to help me navigate space with even finer precision. A map provides me with the information of where things are in relation to each other, and I may be able to decipher what kind of environment I might expect from looking at the various colors of the map. The map has a detailed surface of topological information, but it lacks the temporal fluctuations that constitute the world as I perceive it. Like the brain, the map directs my attention to certain details of the world in order to make sense of it. The map is an age-old desire to make sense of the unruliness of the world. Like the classification system of natural specimen, the map tries to order and arrange that which continues to expand and contract into eternity, multiplying and kicking about, always falling short of including some sensory detail of the world. The herbarium in the island of Madeira have specimens that date back to the 16th century. The frail plants are stored in a carefully controlled environment, providing a blueprint of the natural heritage of the island. Madeira has had its own discrete place in the colonization of the New World, as ships would stop over to acclimatize plants from the tropical colonies, so they could make their ways to the orangeries of the European kings. The nature found today on Madeira is a testament to this past exchange. The European botanists in the age of exploration went into the wild nature of the New World armed with their bell jars and butterfly nets. They were determined to fit it into categories of the newly developed Linnean nomenclature system. The Sensory Cartographer comes with the same desire to capture. She is not nailing butterflies to cold boards or pressing ferns between parchment paper. The Sensory Cartographer is collecting the temporal changes in real time as they flow uncontrollably through her body. An electric resistance in the skin is a telltale signal of the immediate interactions with the environment, present before the brain encounters. What is collected is beyond her control. It is locked and gathered and creates a new reality between her, the instrument of measurement, and the environment, showing their deeply entangled relations. What remains of people is what media can store and communicate. In the natural archive of today, technologies are the butterfly nets with which we perceive the world, the remote sensors that pick up barely perceivable fluctuations of change. Just like the foreign modules on my body can be reconfigured and redesigned to challenge my pre-programmed interaction with the environment, so too can my brain adapt to altered sensory input. My brain is a plastic entity that can adapt when challenged with new inputs to make sense of. It can be challenged to perceive change that occur slowly, perhaps beyond my own lifespan. Like my body sifting through the sea of relations, so too does the technology on my hand enact a highly subjective performance of foregrounding and backgrounding the world. As the instrument measures and recreates, I am made aware of the time I construct by ordering it into sensible frequencies. These rhythms and hums make me feel the presence of the moment, but never captured or fixed. Sensing the presence of these fluctuations here in the oldest forest in Europe, several times pass through me at once.
So that was a video essay we did for an exhibition of this work in 2016. For the last bit, we wanted talk a little bit more about, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Sorry, it's a lot of flipping through screens. So just to wrap up, sorry, maybe you talk while my voice gets, yeah, thanks. So we ended the residency in Madeira by being able to show some of the data that we had collected out on our little expedition next to these dried up plants in this little museum. And since this work in 2016, we've really been focusing on creating more sort of like collaborative explorations of the ideas that we started working with in Madeira. So we've been making a series of different workshops where we invited people to take our technologies and sort of like co-create interventions or develop their own works through the ideas, or taking and remixing some of these ideas. So this one was in Berlin in 2017 in a setting that were an interesting mix of musicians and neuroscientists where we asked them to sort of like create a sort of urban intervention where wearing these devices, measuring the galvanic skin response, which was quite interesting because it is in a way like an instrument that you play with your body, but you have no real conscious control over it. So it was quite an interesting mix that came from that. Another project that we're doing is called the Augmented Attention Lab. Dan, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Maybe you talk about the workshop, I think.
Ah, yeah. Okay.
We can talk more about the workshop.
Yes. Sorry. So another project that we've been working on since we started this project is called the Intimate Earthquake Archive. It started out as my graduation work. I became interested in a phenomenon that's happened for the last 30 years in the north of the Netherlands, where because of gas drilling in the underground, people have experienced man-made earthquakes or gas-induced earthquakes. And as I started sort of looking into this phenomenon, I came across a sort of overwhelming amount of scientific data around the occurrences, but also just in general, the subsurface of the Netherlands. So it's apparently one of the most well-surveyed subsurfaces of a country in the world. And so here you can see a very comprehensive database of all of the earthquakes that have happened since they started in the 80s, I believe. And at the same time, I was spending time with people who were experiencing the earthquakes, and I started sort of wondering where's the role of subjective experience of these tremors, of people's lived experiences on top of this gas field. So this image is one of the people I was staying with who wanted to show me this monument that they raised where the gas was first found. He also told me that he would wake up moments before an earthquake was felt. So what I was really picking up speaking with people there was that they were quite skeptical of the official measurement systems, and it was also in a way that they were turning their own bodies into measurements or into sensors in a way. And so in collaboration with Jonathan and Karsten van Petersen and Marije Bouwman, we created an interactive installation that kind of brought together these two observations. And the work is an installation where you're wearing a wearable that picks up radio signals from 12 different core sample sort of radio stations. And each of them triggers a unique tactile composition on the body that's developed from the actual data that you can find in the Dutch Meteorological Institute database. And Jonathan has worked on creating tactile compositions that almost in a way turn your body into the map of the province, where the vibrations move across the body the same way that they moved across the land. And it's called the Intimate Earthquake Archive, of course, because it's almost like an opportunity to sense the data as this kind of like deep listening experience. And what I really enjoy is when people come back to me after experiencing and say that they still feel the vibrations of these man-made earthquakes in their bodies. So they're almost like archived in their bodies as this kind of tactile memory.
Yeah. Maybe we can have on.
Yeah,
the other works, do you maybe want to just talk a little bit about future work?
Yeah. So we've done a bunch of other collaborative works in different settings, and we're continuing to do so. But because of time constraints, we want to move on to sort of future, what we're working on in the next couple of months. And John, maybe you want to move on to talk a bit about that?
Sure. So I mean, right now we're sort of working, I guess we've been working iteratively on different tools and techniques for creating these sort of intimate experiences and doing sort of field work where it's a little more about kind of like remote gathering sensor data in remote locations and being able to gather kind of a combination of different forms of sensor data. So like in biometric data, but also environmental data. And so we're sort of iteratively developing this platform or this toolkit that's combining different technologies we've built during Sensory Cartographies projects, during our Madeira trip, during the Intimate Earthquake Archive. And we're slowly but surely kind of integrating all of this into a sort of field toolkit, or yeah, like the bell jars and butterfly nets. And this is kind of a prototype of what we've been working on. We're also working on this idea of using sort of almost external organs as a way of attaching different sensors and sensory modalities to this toolkit. So this is kind of a prototype of a wearable water filtration device. And as we're continuing, we're going to be working, kind of doing our next big sensory cartography project on the Waddenzee, which is a large water body in the kind of northwest of the Netherlands, where there's kind of an especially interesting ecosystem because the tidal forces are really affected there, because it's basically like a huge tidal basin. So I mean, that's kind of where we're looking on next.
Yeah. And here I just wanted to also mention, since we have Shannon Mattern listening in, maybe we can have a discussion about it too. Her work has been really inspirational to us, especially thinking about, well, what kind of humans and more than humans and technologies are mapping the world that we co-inhabit, and how can we think of this kind of multifocal and multi-temporal perspective to mapping, and also how can that be part of this idea of a sensory cartography. So there's a great quote here. I think rather than merely incorporating the other as a map subject, we should think more deeply about othering cartographic subjectivity or acknowledging that others have developed their own map-making practices that diverge from Western conventions. So one research tool that we're really interested in developing during this residency we're going to do in the Wadensee is a tool of deep welding. And here's one concept sketch. We want to try to create these kind of remote sensing organs for a festival, which we of course can't go to because of COVID-19, but where we want to create a sort of like intimate sensing link by creating these remote sensing organs that are connected in real time to our sensory experience of the very sort of like immediate sensing of change that you can feel in the Wadensee as the tides are changing, and send that data to these kind of organs that will be exhibited in Bratislava. Another thing that we're interested in thinking about, and then we're going to work with researchers in the Wadensee, is how more than human organisms are also in a sense mapping out environments, and how that can create a sort of more nuanced mapping perspective of a place. So of course the Wadensee is under threat of being flooded as sea level rises, but also because of subsidence as it's close to, as people are protesting gas drilling in Groningen because it's ruining human habitat. They're moving it into the North Sea and thereby ruining habitat for more than human species. So there's a constant sort of like tension going on with extractive industries and the habitats of humans and more than humans. And we're interested in how can we also sort of tap into those kinds of knowledges with our project. There's lots more to talk about. I think you have sort of the idea that it's a very sort of like non-linear project that we're working on here, and with a lot of different threads. And yeah, I think we want to stop here because we would also love to hear what if you have any comments or thoughts. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree. Let's
Okay,
wrap up
so,
here and take some questions.
Yeah.
Feedback.
Yeah. So
Thank you so much, both. If I could ask you to use the blue hand feature, do you want to know where that is? If you click on participants, you get some icons, one of which is a blue hand. Now I can see you, but or you can just jump in if you want.
Thanks for sharing the research, Peddler.
I have a comment just, oh, there we are. Annja, do you want to?
Yes, thank you so much. I have actually two questions, but I think they're interlinked. And I spotted a picture by Ernst Haeckel, who was also a Modera. And of course, he's this great researcher of embryology and has been thinking a lot about reproduction, and especially has been fashioning the scientific image and visuals. And I wondered about your modes of reproduction, and whether in terms of world making, whether you could say a bit more about the space you are creating with your project and with your cartographies and with your own practice, and where do you draw the boundaries, and or what kind of scenography, if you want, or what kind of body are you creating yourself in the way you interact with your environment?
Yeah, I think I often think of what we make as kind of like tools or props for creating different scenarios or yeah, like very loosely passing on certain things that we're grabbing onto in our environments. And I think for me, that also kind of like embodies a little bit like this, what I see maybe as like the reduction of the overwhelming sensory impression of the world into something that's somewhat digestible. So I think, I don't know if this makes a lot of sense, but I always think of like the art practice as a kind of filtering of impressions, and that you're pointing attention to certain things rather than others. So I think with sensory cartographies, like workshop and pressure cooker formats have been really helpful, because it's still, rather than an exhibition, it keeps the format really open, and it's more about kind of like conversations and hacking and playfulness around these topics, rather than, I think the exhibitions we've made have been sort of like, I felt a bit like I was making the taxidermy as well, and then you get like a little bit stuck again in like these weird sharks that it just like look really kind of like that. So I think we did like a pressure cooker as part of Sensorium Festival, which is like an ongoing collaborator of ours called the Augmented Attention Lab, and we brought in like different specialists, and it was just like such a great way of like of exploring the themes, because it became like a multiplicity of other people's practices, and one of the most amazing inputs that we had was about micro phenomenology. So a friend of ours was, his name is Marcello Lusana, who's a researcher in Berlin. He brought in his practice of microphenomenology, which is really about this method of zooming in on the very fine grains of one experience, one sensory experience, and it was almost like an onion that you can constantly dive deeper and deeper into. So there's like also like a zooming in and zooming out, and that helped me really think a lot about, well, how we're always already filtering in and out so much information, and that is like biologically but also culturally conditioned, and there's really like a great plasticity in the way that we pay attention to our surroundings. And I don't think that we would have come up with that ourselves. So this like collaborative approach has really been helpful, and I think we want to expand on that as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think our forms of representation are intentionally anything goes. And one thing that we get out of doing these sort of collaborative pressure cookers and workshops is that we get this incredible pluralism of different representational techniques. I mean, like in the last Augmented Attention Lab, we had a jewelry maker, we had an actual map maker, like a traditional map maker. We had this sound artist, we had like kind of people from all over the sort of aesthetic spectrum, thinking about different ways of representing their experiences. Yeah, I mean, in a recent kind of workshop that we did, where we didn't get a chance to talk about, we were working on creating these kind of like wearable storytelling devices, where it would be kind of like location aware and also environmentally aware. And you would kind of get this sort of story told to you where the map is a story. It's kind of like this nonlinear storytelling system. And actually for the Bodensee, we're really, one of our kind of key research areas is going to be thinking about multiple simultaneous representation. I think that's kind of what we're really working towards also, is kind of building a representational toolkit that's not prescriptive, but more gives kind of higher level tactics for representing these kind of multiple layers that is present in even traditional cartography. I mean, like I went to this cartography institute in Brussels that's amazing, is they have all of the old cartographic equipment there. And traditionally, this equipment was also very idiosyncratic, and every location had their own symbolic systems and techniques. But they would also create these layers. I mean, these maps are basically like these 50-layer screen prints, you know, so there's multiple layers present all the time, even on these early maps. And I think our big challenge is kind of how do you expand that multiplicity into domains outside of this kind of fixed two-dimensional grid, into space, into time, like creating the map as sort of a temporal object, also making it tactile, making it linguistic. So like these are kind of all the things we're constantly playing with, and I think we're continuing to play with.
Yeah, I guess my next question would be, how would you plan on also embedding it onto your website? I had a very quick look onto the website, and I think it's great to have a non-linear website, but it's mainly text and image, isn't it? And then the film, but thinking about sound as well, and augmented reality and mixed reality technologies. Are you planning to expand that as well, or are you focusing on the workshops? Really?
No, we're waiting for funding. And we would love to make our own platform, because this is a platform that also is great. It's provided by the Journal of Artistic Research, and it's open to anybody to use, but it is quite like difficult to work with. Like the interface is rather chunky, so
and we're very limited in terms of how much you can customize it.
Yeah,
because they're really, the Journal of Artistic Research really wants to be able to submit these websites as research documents, to be considered at the same level as like a research publication. And so because of that, they have a lot of limitations, and like legal limitations that they have to follow. So that restricts a bit in terms of being more of an artist or an experimenter in terms of what you can do with this platform. Especially if you know what's possible on the web. I mean, you can do VR on the web, you can do augmented reality on the web, you can do surround sound and spatialized sound on the web. So yeah, I think we've outgrown it at this point. And like Sissel said, we're waiting for money so we can really build our own platform.
Thank you for responding.
Thank you. I think Mikhail has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you as well for the really interesting presentation and insight into that area of research, and also just the way it was done too. It was very seductive, really, and quite easy to be drawn in. But I'm kind of interested in the meaning of it, not in.
Oh, we don't hear you.
We lost you.
Sorry, apologies for that. So I'm interested, did you get the beginning at all? Did you hear me at the start? Okay, you heard me thanking you and saying that was a really seductive. Yeah. Okay, good. Well, I'm sort of interested in the meaning of your work, not necessarily in the way that, let's say, Panofsky would look at perspective, or Hito Starl in recent years. She's written a lot about maps and being in free fall, and the kind of idea and the meaning of always looking down upon in this standardized way. But your work, it was interesting that you showed the example of the Polynesian navigators' techniques and how personal it was. I didn't actually know that it was so unique to the individual themselves. So that makes it sort of interesting in that it's useful, but also useless to others. The idea of something specific or subjective is important, but also problematic. Is your work either unconsciously or actually a kind of critique as well of the pressure in recent, not years, but the last 2 to 3 decades, to be open, to standardize, to share, to work together in enormous, the opposite of intimate teams and so on. So it seems to me there's some inference in what you do that's suggestive of that. You know, the impossibility of perfect standards anyway, that leads to a kind of madness. So your work seems to be bringing us back to something more complex, actually.
Mm.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I think we're really fangirling over Shannon Mattern. She left the conversation now, so I can say it. But the way that she describes this kind of need is specifically in an article she writes called "Mapping's Intelligent Agents," which is about LiDAR mapping and like self-driving cars and how sort of like giving over the mapping and making sense of the world to machines can create some pretty big problems for various reasons, and how she's sort of advocating for this need to have multiple perspectives. So one, of course, is the subjective or the intimate, and others are also incredibly helpful and useful, but it's more sort of like not giving over the main domain of sensing the world to the smartphone or to self-driving cars, but to maintain the importance of these multiple world-making projects. So whether it is the muscle world making its space, or the oil company world making that same space, but and then creating those, I think, layers, as John is telling about, and then I think that's what we're sort of getting at with these slightly useless technologies that we're creating.
Yeah, I think part of it is also just like, don't give up. You know, like mapping was always an active process. It was always an empirical activity, and there shouldn't. I think we're really critiquing this idea that there's a point where you can give up because we have the information, like the information is somehow finished. And by constantly, even if it seems like a useless act to kind of like go and like remap some environment in a completely subjective way, it's keeping the active the knowledge alive in a sense. And I think we're also doing that. Like we're kind of like critiquing this kind of like idea that like data, it's the taxidermy thing, like that information can be like a taxidermized animal. And I think there's that, and then there's the critique of it, of wanting to find a way of kind of creating pluralities that are vivid and alive, kind of pluralities of knowledge in space.
Yeah. So it's always also like a really unfinished project, which we've had to come to terms with.
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
There's a lot of failure and
there's some stuff you just can't communicate.
Yeah.
I mean, like this experience of going out and sonifying your biometric activity is a totally insular experience. I mean, it's a very beautiful experience, but how do you standardize and share that? I mean, it's something that we've futilely tried to brainstorm over also. It's like, maybe you can create like a wearable in another location and like transmit this data and somehow recreate the experience, but of course you can't. So we found, I think the most success we've had with that sort of like incommunicable experience, or that incommunicable sort of understanding of being, is just doing it together, like doing it collectively.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one more question.
Could you say something?
Yes, Alex.
Hi. Thanks so much for that. Could you say something about how you manage the temporalities of the experiences that you create in systems? I mean, sorry, am I clear?
No, it's very soft.
Sorry. Could you say something about how you intentionally manage the temporalities of the experiences that you're creating? I mean, when you talk about augmented attention, do you try to sort of shape a persistence of experience and sort of an awareness of rhythmicity within the recipient, as well as the kind of the immediate experience of the, for example, the microphenomenological?
Do I understand it correct? Like sort of different temporalities of experience, the immediate versus sort of like maybe something that is past?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that.
We're having, you're also quite soft, so I'm trying to recap if I understood the question correctly.
So I'm trying to get, I suppose I'm really trying to get a sense of what the person who's experiencing the work that you create, what their temporal experience of it is. Is it encouraging a kind of an awareness of duration and persistence? For example, in movement over time with sensing technology, is it a kind of prompting reflection on the rhythmicity of those experiences, or is it much more about the kind of the micro, what's intense awareness, augmented awareness, of what's happening in a moment?
I think it's different. So, for instance, the Intimate Earthquake Archive is, of course, an archive of recorded seismic activity. But I like to think of it as like a training ground in a way, that somehow like trains you to listen for these seismic events, because yeah, when I was in Groningen, I didn't feel the earthquakes because I wasn't really attuned to them, because they're not a part of my ecology, because I live somewhere else. I live in The Hague. But the people who were living there and who were agonizing over them for various reasons, for economical or for their fear of their safety, they were incredibly attuned to them. So really, it's a real nature culture phenomenon that is of course a seismic event, but it's also a legal event and a political power grabbing event that has been going on for a long time. So it's really entangled in all of these different realities. And I think the archived data that we're bringing in, I'm hoping through also telling these stories that it becomes clear that the data is like embedded in so many different contexts, and that really determines what kind of environmental changes you're paying attention to and that you're perceiving. So in that sense, I think it has like different meanings. But and for sensory cartographies, yeah, it's really also a question that we thought a lot about. Of course, wearing the meta sensor collectors, it's really like a real-time experience. But I know that John, you've been working also with like archiving the data and playing it back. But it's still like not something we really explored so much yet. The only thing we have done really is like making the workshops and having people engage directly with the technologies, and then printing out the data, which always felt like this taxidermy practice of the past experience that is meaningless to people looking at it. So yeah.
Yeah, I think with the Intimate Earthquake Archive is maybe the most salient example of where we've been playing with temporality actively, because we're compressing 20 years of earthquakes into an experience that lasts maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, depending on how long people want to stay in the installation. And then the earthquakes themselves are compressed in time. So I mean, normally they would be 2 minutes long, but then they're kind of recomposed into shorter amounts of time. But that, I think also it's kind of like a precursor to work that we're aiming to do now. I mean, one project we kind of sketched and conceptualized but never got the chance to make was we wanted to make this sort of like deep time experience of a specific location where kind of immediate sensory data of the environment was combined with sort of scaled and translated historic data kind of on multiple time spans. So maybe like weather in the last so many years versus like more geological time spans of what was happening in the area. So I mean, I think that's kind of something that's yet to be fully explored by us.
Maybe not even possible. Maybe it needs to be speculative.
Yeah, maybe it stays speculative. I don't think it will stay speculative. So
but the storytelling, I think the storytelling aspect would be really fun if it fits in those, because with the data that you have from deep time, it's also a lot of speculation and storytelling, coming up with the continuity. So,
thank you. So do we have any more questions? I will say, for those of you at Sussex, Jonathan's going to be joining us in the autumn for a PhD, which is really exciting. It's part of the Leverhulme. He's one of the new Leverhulme scholars. I understand, Sissel, you'll be around too. We also may be hosting, fingers crossed, funding dependent, we'll be hosting an augmented attention lab at the Sussex Humanities Lab sometime in the future. So any more questions, feel free, we can share contacts, or hopefully we can ask people in person in the future.
Yeah, we're looking very much forward to our Brighton experience. It's yet quite unsure what is going to happen. Multiple unknowns that we're working with right now, but we're really not that far. We're just in the Hague. So.
Yeah, we will get over there eventually.
So looking forward to meeting some of you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Awesome.
There was one question actually. Some people asked me in the chat if the video that you showed, is that on your website?
I will put a link also in, it's on Vimeo for sure.
And then Joe has a question.
So isn't this Vimeo can I change this? Oh, here it is. Right. My computer is struggling a little bit. So that's the video we showed.
Well, thank you.
Another question?
Joe, did you have a question? No, he's gone now.
Thank you, Raminder.
Anyone's welcome to ask any other questions if you like as we're wrapping up. I think people are all done now.
This is an interesting format, right? With the I feel like it the first time I did it, I got really weirded out by just talking to the computer, especially when you share the screen and you don't see anybody at all. Then it's really strange. But I think this time I got. But then we also just talked to each other, so that made it a little bit easier.
Yeah, no, it's good. I thought I would adjust to having a 1 second delay between speaking and hearing, but it's really, really disturbing. You should try a version of like inverted goggles and inverted sound or something to see how long. I guess if you spoke continuously, you would adjust to it. It's really disturbing.
There's an artist who makes those giant steel sculptures. Richard Serra, yeah. He has another work where he's working with this woman, I forget her name, where she's listening to herself speak.
Oh yeah.
With a short delay.
Yeah.
And she cannot string sentences together. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, your brain is really.
That's why I take my headphones off. It's really disturbing. It's amazing.
I think the thesis said
That's
green.
why I'm not finishing any sentences.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but luckily you didn't have to speak so much. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys. It was really great that you could come and do this at such short notice. And yeah, I guess we'll be in touch about all the logistics of you coming to Sussex eventually.
Eventually.
Yeah, we're really
Yeah.
curious about how it will go, and yeah, the news. I think right now we have no news.
No, everyone was telling me just wait until June, and then kind of touch base again, because nobody could tell me anything concrete, and yeah, there was no.
Yeah.
So probably in a week or so, I'm going to take up discussions again with the administration's office and find out what's going on. And I mean, are classes going to resume in the fall, or are they moving the whole thing?
We don't even know yet.
Okay,
So
wow. So,
everyone's being instructed to prepare both remote and in-person teaching. So the campus will be open in some way, but there's no way that normal lectures and normal things are going to be running.
okay.
So yeah, I just wait another couple of weeks, I'd say, because Anna and Jamie, nobody knows. Some of the labs in life sciences have reopened, but yeah, essentially the campus is still shut. Like, we're not allowed to our offices, so there's no certain decisions at all.
Okay. Maybe I should wait a couple weeks even then. Not just, I was going to do it this week, but maybe it's too soon even now to start asking these kind of questions.
Yeah, I mean, by all means, there's the logistics of you actually coming to England as well, right?
Yeah, and I have to also see if that's changed, if the Brexit rules have changed at all. Because according to the earlier EU settlement scheme, I would have to get there in December, the latest. So, yeah, I mean, that would mean that I would have to start in January and move in December.
I think, sorry, I was just going to say, Jonathan, I actually live in France as a British citizen in France. I think that's still true, the December cutoff. As far as I'm aware, I haven't seen anything else. So.
All right, that's good to know. Yeah,
Which are you in? Are you in Holland? Where are you in the Netherlands?
Yeah, in the Netherlands.
Yeah, we were told that we had to reapply for residence as foreign nationals, but it wouldn't start. The process wouldn't start until June, July. But that December deadline was still in place. But I mean, who knows? Hey, Alice, what?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, also people at the International Students Office were telling me, there's a good chance it will change because the COVID has just kind of overtaken everything.
Yeah.
So.
But that requires politicians to be efficient and make decisions, which, there's not too many hopeful signs of that at the moment, shall we say.
Right. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Anyway, well done, Alice, for organising this. It's great, In the meantime, while the chaos plays out in the background, thanks to you both, and thanks to Alice as well for sorting this out.
Can you hear me now if I speak to my phone?
Yeah.
So we should.
It's like there's two Alices. It's a bit. That's even weirder, Alice, right? There's like two of you, like a disembodied double Zoom head.
I won't do that. So, you guys, we can pick this conversation up later on. But John, who you can't see, is someone that we've worked together for a few years doing multisensory wilderness mapping project. So much more instrumentally. So trying to ultimately develop maps for making decisions about wilderness management, and starting off with a critique of top-down GIS maps for different reasons, but basically they don't include all the creatures and beings that the landscape is important to, and saying how can we integrate methods from ecology, methods from anthropology, methods from ethnography, how can we bring the humans and the animals that live in the landscapes literally onto the map for decision makers who manage those parks and things. So yeah, when I first came across your work, I said to John, "Oi, we should we should talk with these guys." So yeah, we'll chat more in the future, because there's a fantastic funding scheme for accessing the Arctic research centres called Interact, and so John and I, with another colleague who's an anthropologist in Finland, did one visit a couple of years ago, and we've just put in to do that in the north of Sweden, and we're waiting to hear if we've got funding for one. Where is it, John? Where did we apply to? Alaska.
Alaska, yeah, because Roger wants to go to Alaska. But yeah, they're all. It's an EU-funded network.
It's funny how these projects always start.
Yeah.
You should look at this website. It's true. It's like it's enough to get anybody excited. It's just like a map of all the Arctic research stations, and the projects set up to sort of make the most of what these research stations can offer in terms of research capacity. But you look at the locations and you just think, wow, yeah, that's quite.
I mean, we were a bit on the edge, so our kind of angle was bringing in John's. What are you, John? A geographer? You're a mountaineer and newly formed environmental humanist. Is that fair?
Well, you can call me that if you want, Alice.
Sort of geography in mountains is John, and I came in with John and I had worked before on bringing sound into this mapping process. So we were kind of using sound and listening as a link between species, if you like, and between levels. So how do you integrate that in situ experience, multi-sensory experience now on the mountain with the higher level and longer term data sets that you need to make decisions and be able to generalize, kind of thing. So very similar, really similar themes to what you're talking about, but sort of flipped around in a way to say, how is there a way we can possibly capture these subjective, all the voices of all the others subjectively, but how can we integrate that with a GIS map in a way that can actually helpfully inform decision making? And we haven't got to that. It's work in progress as well.
But what we did do a lot of, certainly, was look at how they differ. I know you referred to that earlier on in the talk, that you were saying that what was clear, I can't remember who it was, I can't remember the name now of the person who'd done the research, but that there was a huge kind of divergence between these traditional top-down maps and the more kind of traditional local perceptions of landscape. And so that was one thing that we were looking at, was exploring different ways of kind of measuring that difference. How do you compare them? How can you actually compare them and produce something that's super measurable as an output, which could then feed into this sort of decision-making process as
Judith van der Elst, who you've worked with.
Yeah. She's actually back. She's trying to get back now to New Mexico. Well, now she's back in. She's a bit of a nomad, but
she's really an interesting person.
Yeah, she would be really interesting perspective.